MotoGP does not lose riders slowly. It loses them in moments of hesitation. By the time the paddock admits a mistake, the contract is already signed, the garage already hollow, the future already rerouted. KTM is now standing inside that moment. Pedro Acosta is not drifting away because KTM is slow. He is drifting away because KTM is uncertain. And uncertainty is the one thing a generational rider cannot afford when the sport is about to reset its own physics. The paddock is pretending this is a normal contract cycle. It isn't. The 2027 regulations have turned MotoGP into a preemptive land grab. New 850cc engines, Michelin gone, equal-spec rhetoric masking a brutal redistribution of power. Riders are no longer choosing teams, they are choosing structures. Acosta entered MotoGP as a disruption event, not hype, not potential. A reference shift, a rider whose instincts bypass data, a rider whose speed arrives before explanation. A rider Marc Marquez publicly identified as a mirror, not a successor. That comparison alone should have triggered emergency protocols. Instead, KTM treated Acosta like a process. Processes are safe. Generational riders are not. After 2 full seasons in MotoGP without a single victory, something Acosta had never experienced in his professional career, patience stopped being a virtue. It became friction. Friction turns into language. Language turns into leverage. Now, the rider market is not circling KTM's performance, it's circling KTM's credibility. This is not a story about tire vibration or missed upgrades. This is a story about what happens when a factory builds an entire identity around ready to race and then forgets that racing is not the same thing as winning. Because when a system loses the one rider it was designed to protect, the problem is not the rider. The problem is the system. And MotoGP has never been kind to systems that fumble generational talent. Pedro Acosta was not supposed to be debatable. From the moment he entered Grand Prix racing, his trajectory was linear and violent. Moto3 world champion in his rookie season. Moto2 title contender by 2023. A rider whose learning curve looked less like a curve and more like a vertical line. When he stepped into MotoGP in 2024, the expectation was not survival. It was acceleration, and he delivered. He fought for the podium in his first race in Qatar. He stood on the podium weeks later in Portugal. He collected 9 podiums across sprints and Grands Prix. There were crashes, there always are, but the paddock saw through them immediately. This was not a rider finding limits. This was a rider arriving early. Year 2 was supposed to clean the margins. Year 2 was supposed to unlock victories. Instead, Year 2 stalled. KTM promoted Acosta into the factory team for 2025, believing continuity would do the heavy lifting. What they underestimated was how fast MotoGP punishes stagnation. The 2025 RC16 did not regress loudly. It failed quietly. Braking performance weakened. Rear tire degradation became chronic. Vibration, amplified by Michelin's stiffer rear carcass, punished aggressive corner entry. This mattered because Acosta's riding style demands authority on entry. Take that away, and you don't just slow him down, you strip his identity. After 9 rounds of the 2025 season, the numbers were blunt. 0 podiums, 2 fourth-place finishes as a ceiling. No realistic race-winning scenarios in his rookie season. He already had 5 podiums by the same point. Contrast is how MotoGP speaks, and the contrast kept getting worse. Fermin Aldeguer, another rookie, won in Indonesia on a Ducati. Raul Fernandez, once a KTM prodigy, won on an Aprilia. Meanwhile, Acosta was being asked to trust updates that arrived late and explanations that arrived early. By Silverstone, the language broke containment. I don't accept, and I'm not patient. Opportunity passes one time in life. That was not frustration. That was a deadline. 2 weeks later, Acosta publicly questioned why nothing had arrived between races. KTM intervened. Not with performance, with conversation. When factories start managing language instead of results, the damage is already structural. But this is where the entire story snaps. The hidden contradiction is this. KTM markets itself as rider first, but its development philosophy forces riders to adapt to concepts rather than shaping them. The political betrayal was not failing to win races. It was convincing Acosta that patience was a virtue while the entire paddock was accelerating toward 2027. The technical flaw was not vibration or braking instability. It was the belief that incremental progress would be enough in a sport preparing for a hard reset. And the psychological rupture is fatal, because once a generational rider believes his timeline is incompatible with the factories, the negotiation is already over. KTM's biggest mistake was not technical, it was comparative. MotoGP is not experienced in isolation, it is experienced in contrast. Every time Acosta was beaten by a Ducati, the lesson repeated itself. Ducati converts potential into outcomes. Aprilia converts momentum into belief. Honda converts legacy into leverage. KTM converts promise into patience. The power shift did not announce itself, it accumulated. Maverick Vinales found early direction with the RC16. Acosta didn't. KTM insisted convergence would come, but convergence requires belief, and belief requires evidence. While KTM searched for balance, Ducati stacked proof. 4 factory-spec motorcycles, multiple race winners, a development philosophy that adapts to riders, not ideologies. Aprilia, operating with fewer resources, delivered 3 wins in the final 10 rounds of 2025 and exited the season with title legitimacy despite Jorge Martin's injury chaos. KTM exited winless. That is where leverage migrates. Not because KTM lacks talent, but because MotoGP rewards clarity. Acosta's options began to solidify in silence. VR46 Ducati offered immediate competitiveness and a clean path toward factory relevance. Honda offered financial power and emotional legacy ahead of 2027. Factory Ducati offered insurance against any internal fracture involving Marc Marquez. Each option carried certainty. KTM carried explanation. This is the critical difference riders feel before they articulate it. Behind the scenes, KTM accelerated its 2027 program, even track testing its new engine early. The message was obvious: this project is alive. But early tests are not trust. To a rider, an early engine is not a promise. It is a presentation. If reports are accurate, and Acosta has already signed a 2027 deal, the destination matters less than the timing. He didn't wait. He didn't hedge. He didn't extend belief. That alone is the verdict. Because if KTM had convinced him, there would be no secrecy. The power reversal, everything you thought you understood, stops working here. The advantage flips when talent no longer believes development will catch up. The hero becomes exposed when patience replaces aggression. The underdogs become threats because they are structure, not hope. And strategies collapse because no factory can outnegotiate a rider who already sees the end of the cycle. MotoGP is not watching Acosta leave KTM. It is watching KTM lose leverage. The consequences of losing Pedro Acosta extend far beyond one rider slot. This is reputational damage. KTM's entire junior ecosystem exists to produce riders like Acosta. The Rookies Cup, Moto3, Moto2. The latter is supposed to end in MotoGP dominance. Instead, it now ends in exit strategy. Brad Binder is respected but not seismic. Vinales is capable but volatile. Bastianini has underdelivered. Remove Acosta and KTM loses its narrative anchor. More dangerous is the signal this sends to the next generation. If the most gifted rider of his era looks at KTM during a regulation reset and decides the risk is not worth it, what does that say to the next prodigy watching from Moto2? Factories don't just compete on bikes, they compete on belief ecosystems. KTM now approaches the rider market weakened. Financial uncertainty clouds long-term guarantees. Technical direction remains questioned. Development credibility has taken visible damage. Replacing Acosta will be difficult. Replacing what he represented will be nearly impossible. MotoGP history is unkind to factories that fumble generational talent during transition eras. Honda lost Marquez's trust and never regained the same authority. Ferrari burned Vettel's prime chasing purity. Football clubs lose golden generations by mistaking loyalty for progress. KTM did not lose Acosta because of one bad bike. It lost him because it failed to align urgency with reality. The future threat, and now the part nobody is ready for. The 2027 era will not forgive hesitation. The equal spec reset will reward teams with clarity and punish those still searching for identity. If Ducati fractures internally, Acosta becomes insurance. If Honda resurges emotionally, Acosta becomes catalyst. If KTM enters 2027 without him, it enters exposed. The threat is not losing one rider. The threat is becoming a factory rider's pass-through on the way somewhere else. That is how relevance erodes. Pedro Acosta was never meant to be a lesson. He was meant to be the proof that KTM's system worked, proof that loyalty could coexist with ambition, proof that ready to race meant ready to win. Instead, he has become a case study. If he leaves, KTM will survive. Factories always do, but survival is not dominance. MotoGP history does not remember factories that almost delivered. It remembers the ones that align talent, timing, and trust. If Acosta had chosen Ducati straight out of Moto2, this story might already be over. But MotoGP thrives on irony. KTM found him. KTM shaped him. KTM could not keep him. Expect the unexpected? No. This was entirely predictable. GP24 doesn't cover MotoGP. We document its wars. Subscribe and enlist.